As Jenna said, I'm Christian Gaston. I'm leading the consultant team with the LOC Revenue Reform Project. I'm joined here with my colleague Mark Weiner from Winnie Mark. When we approached the toolkit, we were thinking about how to encapsulate the things that we learned from the focus groups around the state, and then how we could take some of the learning that we have had over the years working on a range of revenue reform efforts across the state, both with cities, with regions, and with education districts, how to take what we've learned in this last round of research, apply it to what we've learned in the past, and then give a comprehensive guide for cities moving forward. So at a very high level, some things that we learned during the focus groups, some of this will not be surprising to folks who've been in the trenches for many years, but unfortunately we found that while there is a funding crisis coming to cities, voters don't see it yet. In fact, in all of our focus groups, voters largely said, we think that cities have the resources that they need, but we don't necessarily believe that they're prioritizing the correct way. Secondly, we learned that there is a perceived crisis in growth management. This ranges from people who think that there's too much building going on in their communities, there's too much traffic, the new buildings are too large, they're blotting out the sky, preventing them from seeing nature, or things are happening that aren't for them. This sense of a disconnect between the way that their city's running and the way that they'd like to see it running gives us some insights into the sorts of issues that might be helpful in starting revenue conversations more broadly than around specific projects. Mark, will you talk a little bit about how voters perceived the way that they could get information from their city government?
Yes, and first of all, I just want to give a shout out to LOC here. The research project that we're talking about, we've talked about the focus groups, 6 places around the state. I've been doing this for a long time. This is probably the most geographically diverse and extensive research in trying to figure out what people in different parts of Oregon feel. It was also followed up with polling. So we are working from a pretty rich set of data, and once again, tip the hat to LOC for investing in this. It did give us a lot of insight. As Christian said, voters don't really see there being a revenue problem, just a priorities problem. And they don't really feel a deep connection to their city government. They don't really know where to turn for information about city government, even though we know that all of the people here watching this who are involved in city government do their level best to provide information, to provide it in an accessible way. But the reality is that while people think they don't know where to turn for information about their city government, in part it's because they've never really turned to anything for information about city government. And what that tells us is that while we are all very aware of what's going on, we should never make any assumptions that your customers, your voters, also know it. So it's not just a matter of having a place for them to turn, but it's a matter of putting it in front of them in ways that match their day-to-day life. That can be a challenge. We're going to talk a lot about how to do that. But one of the other dynamics here is even if people don't have the information and they don't turn to a source for that information, if they know it's there to access if they wanted to, that's almost half the battle. But right now people feel like, city governments or any government at any level, they just do things and they don't let us know and they do it in the dark of night. If they become aware that there are easily accessible ways to learn that information, even if they don't access it, you get some credit for that, because then they feel a little guilty that they don't know what's going on. They know it's not the city's fault for not sharing information. They just, in their busy day, haven't accessed it. So even making people aware there are these sources, whether or not they access them, it's an important thing for voters to know. And the other thing is where they are getting their information is what you can see in the slide there, is we're saying sources with high levels of noise. Well, what do we mean by that? We mean that people think that Nextdoor is a legitimate news source. Now, Nextdoor is not a legitimate news source. It promulgates information that may or may not be accurate, and is mostly people, who have an axe to grind. But in these days of a deteriorating media environment, where there are little or no local news sources, and what news sources remain are very strapped and aren't able to report on things, people rely on social media, Nextdoor, Facebook, to get what they believe is authoritative information. And the reason we bring that up is it's important to know that when people think something is true when it is not anywhere near true, we can all find that frustrating, but we need to know that that's sort of the reality of the way people are taking information in, and it is something you want to adjust for as you are looking at ways to communicate with your citizens.
So we've taken kind of like a ground level view of how you get from that skeptical no to yes with your voters. As we're laying out the findings from our focus groups, it sounds like the environment's very challenging. And as many of you know who've tried to raise revenue or fill a budget gap or even fund a popular project, we are in a fairly difficult political environment. But it's not an impossible political environment. As many cities all across Oregon have shown, if you engage with your community early and you build on success, you can pass successful funding measures. So the guidebook and the toolkit walk through essentially a set of best practices for how to do that. You'll see on the slides right here the broad overview. We're going to go into each one of these steps. But first you need to define the problem. Then you need to build teams and solutions to address the problem. Then prepare for the implementation, and then the implementing vote. So let's start with defining the problem. What do we mean by that? At the core of this work, say you want to build a new firehouse, replace a library, increase police call response times by increasing funding for officers. All of these things are problems that you could identify in your community. What you need to do is figure out if those problems resonate with voters. What we're saying here is you don't want to start with a problem that you've identified as a city administrator. You want to start with a problem that your voters have identified as a true crisis in their community that they want government action on. Mark, can you talk a little bit about the early stages of developing relationships inside the community and some of the people and city leaders you might bring in early on as you're talking about how to solve something?
Sure. But before that, I want to say two things. First of all, Christian and I are going over sort of the top lines of how to get to yes. I really want to recommend the guidebook, the toolkit that has been published by LOC. You can access it on the LOC site and probably in a couple of different ways. That is a very detailed how-to manual of how step-by-step to do the things that we're talking about overall. It's another way I'll tip my hat to LOC, investing in something like this. There's a very rich, detailed instruction manual that goes along with this. And I'd really encourage anyone who's thinking about looking for a way to raise revenue to take a long look at it. And we can also answer questions as we go today. But there's also a fundamental attitude you have to be successful in this. And don't look at your voters, don't look at your citizens as your boss or people who you are helping to deliver services to. All those things are true. Look at them as a customer. Everything we're talking about mimics a retail sales environment. And if you are looking at the people who will eventually have to say yes or no to a revenue strategy, whether it's something you need to put on the ballot, or it's even something that you can enact as a city council or city government, but is still subject to people gathering signatures and saying, no, I didn't like that, what you're doing there. They are essentially a customer. And that is a mindset that will serve you very, very well. Not just serve you well, it's absolutely necessary to have success. So, who are your customers? Well, there's a lot of versions of them. As Christian is saying, there are different elements of the community who form different customer bases? Well, first of all, there's just the voters. Eventually, the voters will have the last say, and so you're dealing with them in sort of an individual retail way. But they all belong to different groups or communities of interest. You have your local business community, and the local business community is not monolithic, right? You have sort of Main Street retailers who depend on people coming into their stores or their businesses. You have larger employers. So the business community, that is one of the stakeholders that you need to be having constant communication with. There's also people who are organize their thinking about the neighborhood they live in. So you probably have a network of neighborhood associations, either an official one or an unofficial one. You have people who belong to other groups that I lovingly call hats and animals groups, because they either wear funny hats or they're named for animals, and the elks, the lions. That's another place where people gather. They talk amongst themselves, and they see themselves as having a commonality of interest. I'm not going to go exhaustively through all of these things, but these are the kinds of groupings that you should be aware of, the way they gather, the way they discuss with things amongst themselves. And they are groups that you want to have a constant level of communication and a feedback loop with, because ultimately, as you'll hear, they are going to be central to whether you succeed or you do not succeed.
So as Mark's describing, it might sound to a lot of folks listening in that we're talking about stakeholder engagement. We're not really talking about defining a problem inside the city budget. But as the focus groups show us, many of your voters don't really follow the city budget carefully, and they may not understand that you're grappling with a municipal revenue shortfall. And that's probably not even the way to start the conversation with them. The way to start the conversation with your voters in your community, as we've learned, is the way Mark's describing it. Building a strong relationship with your community and your voters so that they believe that you're all rowing in the same direction. So the way that we operationalize this in the toolkit is we lay out a process whereby you would build a small group of local leaders who can work with you to identify a problem, then pull them together and create an iterative process where you've got a central leadership team, probably consisting of your city manager and senior city directors, but also perhaps with people in the community who have a vested interest in seeing something through. In many cases, a library organization will have a foundation or a nonprofit wing with community leaders that are at the table. Bring them in early so that they can help you shape the solution that you're trying to build to fund the gap in your budget. This team will need to create a process where they're looking at core functions of whatever you're proposing to do to solve your problem. If you're looking at a local income tax, you'll have lots of different questions that you'll have to answer along the way. Think of it like this. You'll need to solve for the policy, the politics, and then you'll also have to figure out a communications plan, a legal strategy, and all the logistics. This leadership team needs to have an iterative process where they're constantly checking as the plan is being formed, whether these particular angles are all in check. So what does that mean? Well, sometimes you can come up with a really great policy. It's the simplest fit, and you talk to your finance office, and they say, well, that's great. We'll just pass a local sales tax. No problem at all. Take it to city council. Maybe they even adopt it. But then it gets referred to voters, and it gets repealed. That's a situation where the politics didn't quite match the policy and the logistics. So in each of these cases, what we're recommending is that you create an iterative process and you take your time building a solution that both has support from the public, has the ability to be enacted, has the ability to be defended at the ballot if it's going to go there, and it's something that the city can actually implement. Because oddly enough, you're sometimes in a worse situation if you pass a new revenue measure and then can't quite implement the program that it was meant to pay for.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, first of all, one of the important things about having that outreach to different parts of the community is, as Christian says, as someone running a city, as a group running a city, you definitely have a very clear understanding of where the shortfalls are, what you need to do, what the budget is able to afford, what it is not able to afford. But voters have their own way of processing this information. And so it's sort of what they call a Venn diagram, when you have two circles and then you want to see what the overlap is. You want to make sure there's enough overlap in what you perceive as a city leader as a problem and what voters perceive as a problem. Because if we had a little line there, they won't buy won't buy something they don't want, no matter how you sell it. So that's one of the reasons for that. And then back to what Christian was saying about having these different groups, legal, communications, political. Those are not sequential. If you are not checking in with all of those things as you're developing it, you will have, in Monopoly they say, do not go straight to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200. You don't want to get too far down the process and realize, oh, we weren't checking in on the legal ability to do this, or where the public is and will they support it. And so you really need to measure twice and cut once. And as we said in the previous slide, that takes time. Both Christian and I have been involved in a number of projects, including one we're involved in right now, which we will not name, where there was an idea that, we're going to do this thing and we're going to want to go to the ballot on, say, a November even-numbered year election. But as you go through the process, making sure that you're constantly checking in, that all the boxes are ticked, you need to be willing to be flexible and say, you know what, we're not quite ready yet and we need to adjust our timing. And that may hurt because you had this plan that, oh, well, by November we're going to get it done. But you are far better off coming to the voters or coming to the public square with something that's got all the vetting necessary and being able to do it then. So know that this process takes time. There are a lot of things you need to check in on. Take the time. Don't be ruled only by the calendar and your vision of it. And you'll be thankful when you take the time to do it right.
And I want to dial back a little bit and think about the scale of this effort, right? This sounds like something that would be very time consuming. It would require a lot of dedicated employees. And, we recognize that the league represents cities of all sizes. I'll tell you from my experience, I worked for many years in Washington County as a reporter and watched many cities tackle various revenue shortfalls with a lot of different strategies. The successful ones followed this basic model. They worked directly with their community. They built strong relationships. They had a good communications plan, and they had an iterative process, and they went to the ballot when they were ready. These strategies can be scaled up and scaled down. And by design, we've written the toolkit in a way to hopefully allow all cities to see themselves in this. And here's another example of where leaning on volunteers can actually be a benefit as opposed to a hindrance. Having people from outside the city government engaged in these project teams can be a huge benefit, not only because they can provide continuity after a measure is referred with supporters who are outside of the government, but also they're giving you a direct line into how your community is talking about the work that you're doing as a city and showing you the shortfalls that you need to overcome to build confidence and support. So this iterative process is engineered to make sure that you feel like you have the confidence to move forward. When you're ready to move forward with something, you think, okay, well, we've identified what we want to build, we've identified how we want to pay for it, we feel like the community is pretty much with us. Let's see if this is ready to go. And to Mark's point, let's see if we can figure out what kind of timeline we're on for the ballot. So that's when we go into the sort of prepare to implement phase. That's when you should really start thinking about broadening your stakeholder engagement, being very public about your ideas. The reason why is that you want to have as many people in your community talking about your idea as possible to test whether or not that early stakeholder engagement was truly reflective of the community attitudes. This is where you start to see some red flags if your preparation hasn't been too successful. So you'll start to see people who you would think would be supportive, but they just don't quite get what you're talking about when you're in a town hall with them. Or maybe people are showing up to city council and they're saying, hey, I don't really like this idea that you guys are talking about. that's a good sign for you to take a step back and say, well, maybe we aren't quite ready to move. Maybe we should do some more stakeholder engagement. Maybe we should have a couple more town halls to really flesh out what this concern is. Now I'm gonna ask Mark to talk a little bit about formal public opinion research. But again, we are very cognizant of the fact that many cities won't have the resources to do official, formal public opinion research, and that's fine. There are lots of strategies that you can deploy to better understand, maybe not from a scientific perspective, but better understand where voters are at. One strategy is to include a survey in utility billings or other mailings that are routinely sent by the city to voters. Town halls are a great opportunity. And Mark mentioned some of the community groups that routinely have public meetings that you can bring your idea to and get feedback. Mark, can you talk a little bit about public opinion research and some of the guidelines we like to think about there?
Absolutely. I do want to add that one of the tools, you can run town halls, but these existing community groups, you should have a we call it a speakers bureau. People from the city and maybe even supporters from the community can go to these, ask to be invited to these meetings to bring up the situation. We have a problem, we have a need, here's what we're thinking, what are you thinking? But in terms of the formal public opinion research you can do, well, as Christian says, there's polling, and that's something we would always recommend if you can afford to do it. But it might be good to step back and talk about sort of the physics of community support. Now, there are some people who are always going to be gung-ho with you. They love their city. They understand that nothing is free, and that revenue is important to be able to pay for the things that we all believe is part of a good city, part of a good lifestyle. Now, that's a smaller group of people, because as we said when we did the focus groups and we did the polling, people think cities have enough money, but they can also identify things that they would like to see. So you have that group of people. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got people who are just heck no. They're never going to vote for a revenue measure or a tax increase or a new strategy. Depending on the political environment, what community you're in, how the economy is going generally, that's usually somewhere in the 30 to mid-30s, sometimes the high 30% level. It's just good to know that those folks are out there. Because you're going to have to do the math beyond the people who just vote reflexively no. So who are you left with? You're left with people sort of in the mushy middle. There are people who say, well, maybe you could get me there, but I need a lot more information, or I need to understand, that you're addressing a need that I think is a need, or I, want to make sure that the money that I'm voting for is going to go to exactly what it is I want, and that is, are there accountability measures? So you're going to be spending most of your time with those folks and figuring out what they need. There are a lot of ways to identify them. Once again, polling is the most scientific way to do it. But if you have a robust public information and communications operation, you should be taking careful notes and taking down names. If people care enough to be able to send in an email or respond to an online or a paper survey, keep a really good record of it, because as Christian said earlier, you're going to need those people later. But then there's another group that you might not think you'd be spending time with. And it's people who are not hell no to everything, but they're not with you. And one of the things that most revenue measures cannot withstand on the ballot is paid opposition. If you have something on there and there's somebody or a group of people or an interest that says, I am going to spend money in a political campaign to tell people to vote no, that is very, very difficult to overcome. I won't say it's impossible. We've, at times been able to prevail, but it's a really tough row to hoe. So if, as you're going through this process, as Christian indicated, you're starting to hear people be a little cranky or saying, I don't think I like that, spend some time with them. Figure out what their problem is. And if there is a way to get them to, okay, I get it. There is this need that may not be the worst, idea in the world. Look, in a perfect world, they'll say, you bet, where can I send a check? You can use my name as a supporter. But really what you're trying to do is make sure that they're just not going to put any money behind a no campaign, because that is difficult to withstand. And understanding who those folks are and inoculating against that may be one of the most important things you're doing, is you're building a proposal and a strategy to get it passed. And at the end of the day, as this last bullet tells you, as they often say, nature bats last, so do voters. At the end of the day, they're the boss, and they will have the last word. And just never forget that, and never forget they're your customers, and you want to treat them right.
So if you've gotten to this point in the process of raising revenue, you've worked with the opposition to reduce their opposition, you've built a strong coalition, you've got a strong communications plan in place, and you're ready to go. We like to refer to the sort of pre-flight checklist at the end of the road. This is a good way to gut check whether or not your city council is ready to take the hard vote of raising revenue. So we're just going to run through them real briefly. First of all, you do want to have some sense of the public opinion. Again, small cities can do this without paid public opinion research. The public opinion polling is the most scientifically effective method, of course, but working with your town halls, organizations that run town halls, working with community groups, faith leaders, people to really truly understand where the public is, you want to have a good, solid sense that there are folks on the other side of the vote that are going to support this campaign. Second, you want to have a solid legal strategy. And I'm going to ask Mark to talk a little bit about this, but the legal strategy isn't just on the policy of the revenue or the program that you're going to implement, but you also need a strong legal strategy when it comes to the ballot itself. Mark, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. The most important words that will be in any measure is the ballot language. It is the one thing voters are going to read before they decide whether to vote yes or no. Now, typically many cities will come to a policy decision and come to a program, and they figured out all the nuts and bolts, and they go to their legal counsel, whether you have in-house counsel or you're working with a contracted legal counsel, which a lot of smaller cities do, and you say, here's this thing we want to do, could you give us some ballot language? And then the lawyers will come back with ballot language. Do not do this. Lord love them. Lawyers do lawyering better than non-lawyers, but this is a communication strategy as much as it is a legal strategy. And lawyers will give you something that is legally sufficient and accurate and meets all the requirements of state law or your charter in describing a measure, and the language they give you could tube you right at the get-go. If you don't have ballot language that is clearly identifying what you're going to do, how it will solve a problem that your voters perceive to be a problem or a good cause, and gives voters confidence that not only does this try to address it, but it will address it accountably. If all of that isn't in your ballot language, you're going to have a really hard time. And sometimes that means rolling up your sleeves with your lawyers and saying, I understand what you wrote and I really appreciate it, but we have some needs in this, and they need to be reflected in the ballot language. And the lawyers will say, well, that's not in the law. And so my tip for this, which has worked in the past, is don't tell me what you think I need to do. Explain to me exactly and in great detail why I can't do what I would like to do to communicate through the ballot language. And it turns out there's a big space between what they say you need to do and what they can't tell you not to do to adequately communicate. So I've already talked a lot more about ballot language than you've probably heard anyone else talk about it, but I assure you that that is going to be an incredibly important moment, and you can turn to our friends at LOC who have long experience in sort of this push and pull. It's really important.
So the other thing that's incredibly important with all of these efforts is a strong communications plan. Now that's not what most people think it is. What we're talking about here is understanding the messages that actually resonate with voters and your community members, and then incorporating those messages as the mainline message for all materials. So Mark just talked about the ballot title. You want your ballot title to be reflective of the most comprehensive, the most easily read and understood way of describing what you're trying to do. You also want all of your supporters to have those talking points in hand. You don't want people to be just sort of guessing about how to talk about these things, especially if your issue is contentious at all. If you have supporters talking about the wrong aspects of your plan, that may just help buttress the opposition or build more opposition. So the communications plan is really about how to find the most salient, persuasive, and clear-eyed messages, and then incorporate them in all of your materials. And also to prepare your community support with all of those materials moving forward. So again, the League of Cities is a great resource for this, for navigating this difficult line that city leaders often have to, where you're working on a project and then your council refers it to the voters and all of a sudden it's a political question and your city staff have limitations under the law. The League has great guidelines on how to navigate this line, but the thing that you should keep in mind is that up until that line, as you're working with your community to build support for your project, all of those community members hopefully will carry forward their support after the council vote. And so you want to make sure that those community members are armed with both the communications plan, the communications strategy, and a good sense of the public opinion that's going to help enable them to build a campaign or whatever effort on the ground that's going to be necessary to take this thing all the way across to success.
I want to add to that, as somebody who does campaigns in part for a living and does paid media and all that stuff, I will still say the most effective form of political communication is a conversation that two people have while they're at the checkout stand at Safeway or Fred Meyer. And that's what Christian is talking about. Anybody who is on your supporter list, who ever came to a town hall meeting, whose name you wrote down when they gave you a comment, you want to give them the tools to talk about. And the other thing is, there's that old question, if a tree falls in the forest and there was no one there to hear it, did it make a noise? I don't know, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but it doesn't matter. If you are putting out a lot of information and you're sending out a press release to your one remaining local news outlet, or you're posting it on your city website, that's fine, you should do it, but that's not enough. You need to go to where the people are. Another strategy, we've done a lot of work on bonds and levies in different communities. And remember, we were talking about the Speakers Bureau. Well, there is only so much that city staff can legitimately say once something's on the ballot. You can go to a meeting and explain what's in it. You can send out mailings that aren't advocating for a yes vote or a no vote, but are giving voters the information they need. Once again, you can do that in the mail, but you can also do it in person. Now, because there's only so far city staff can say, what some people have done very successfully, do it carefully, but it is perfectly legal and appropriate, is you have a buddy. So remember, Christian was talking about the Library Foundation. Library Foundation is not a governmental entity. So the city government can come out and say, we have this measure, it's a library bond that's going to be building this here and that there, and here are all the things that it will provide. And then I'd like to turn to our friends at the Library Foundation who can tell you a little more. And your friends at the Library Foundation can be a bit more advocate. You say, we don't work for the government, we are not publicly funded, so we can tell you why this is a good thing for the community, and it's why a good thing for education and our families and our kids. We have done this over the years to pass bonds and levies, and in a couple of cases actually create districts, which may or may not be helpful in your city's infrastructure. So very important that that communications plan is outward facing and active, not just providing information and hoping that when that tree falls in the forest, there's someone happens to be around to hear it.
And I think with that, we're going to wrap up this section here and move to some Q&A, right, Jenna?
Yeah.
But before we do, I just wanted to offer up, the core here is that you really aren't going to be able to sell voters on something that they don't want to buy. So at the very fundamental stages of developing strategies for addressing your revenue shortfall in your city, or to build a new project or increase services, you really need to dig deep and figure out what your community wants of you. Because if you can find that, if you can identify what the voters want you to do, then you can find a path towards actually funding it and doing it.
And then I'll say one more thing, and I'm really repeating something, but it's really important. You're not alone in this. I'll recommend you back to the toolkit, which really does have really specific step-by-step things you can do. You also have an ally and an assist with League of Oregon Cities. Does this looking all over the state at cities of every size and financial capacity. And there is, once you get to the point where, you know, we're going to have to do this, we're going to have a campaign, there are folks like Christian and I and other people who you can bring into the tent. Bring them in early. Don't put this on the ballot and then say, oh, you know what, we better have somebody who's going to help us with the campaign. The skill set, whether it's LOC or pollsters or, you know, political advisors or consultants like Christian or I, you want to incorporate them early while you're building the thing, because if you build it right, the task of getting it over the finish line is so much easier. So reach out to people at every stage of this. There are plenty who want to help, and plenty who believe in the important work that you guys do in, you know, creating a livable state, a livable city, and a place that gives us all a better future.
Awesome. Thank you both for going into kind of how to build a strategy. For those who are joining us online, we have a Q&A function. Please put your questions there, and I will read them to our panelists, and we can get those answered. But starting with one question that I have, because we talked a lot about ballot measures, does this apply to other funding measures that are administrative, right, that don't have to go out to the voters, but just go to a vote of council?
Absolutely, and for two reasons. First of all, depends on your charter and depends on the nature of the measure, but some of these things can be put up for a referendum. So, and we have seen cities who will remain nameless, but I'm sure have a very painful memory of this, where they do something that's really necessary and it's really good public policy, and the voters are just not with you and hadn't been adequately brought along during the development of it, and they, you know, they gather some signatures, they put it on the ballot, and it can all be for naught. So there is certainly that. And then many of the people, not all of the people in this, in watching at home, as they say, are elected officials. And remember when I say voters bat last? You can pass something, and even if it survives, you might not. So you want to be cognizant of all those things. And by the way, I know a lot of elected officials who are not, most of them really, who are not primarily driven by whether or not they're going to be successful on the ballot or on election day. You folks are doing this because you believe in it, it's the right thing to do, and many of you are willing to take tough decisions. But there's no reason to take a beating unnecessarily. And so even if it's not something that you're referring directly to the ballot, one way or another, the voters are going to be heard.
And I would add, Jenna, one of the things that I think is incredibly important for cities is to constantly be thinking about their budgeting process and the way that they're engaging with their voters through that process. Because when we look at the focus groups, you know, people are really grappling with, you know, boy, I don't know, why is there a municipal funding crisis coming? You know, they're just not tracking the city budget, they're not tracking the investments. Having boosters in your community that say, hey, you know, we've been talking about the lack of funding for police in this city for 15 years, and I'm really glad that the city council is finally doing something about it. That's the kind of local leadership that is just so critical, as Mark mentioned, in turning people from a maybe or a no to a yes. And we're encouraging all cities to think about these strategies for just their general budgeting every year. You know, think about how your citizen review boards are incorporated into your budget process. Think about how you're setting up your city council meetings so that more people can engage. Because if the voters are in your community saying, I see a gap. I see services that we should be funding that we can't because the property tax system doesn't allow it. That's going to give you a much better environment to bring new revenues to voters than otherwise.
I'll tell you something else that's incredibly important. Election day, even if you win, is not the end of your work. Success breeds success. If you are able to get a revenue measure because you have identified a need, your voters agree with the need, they agree sufficiently for the mechanism of delivering it, and you get them to say yes, that's fantastic. But you need to continue to communicate. Here's what we would like to do. Here's what we did with your help. Here's how it's going. And if you are keeping that feedback loop, if it is for example, it's a serial levy, or it's a bond that replaces itself. As one comes off, you need to have another one because you have a long-term need for investment. Your ability to say, you gave us a chance, we did what we said, it did what we said it would do, now we need to do more, that hill gets less and less steep. And I can give you, I won't take the time, but I can give you many jurisdictions in this state, counties, cities, more, who have found that over time, voters build some trust, build some grace. And so this isn't just a way to pass one thing. This is a way of life. This is your SOP in dealing with your voters. And the success will build on success, and you will find it becomes easier over time if you're applying the tools we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you both for that answer. I think one of the things that, we always struggle with is like, oh, well, this one is simply just, I can do this as an elected official through council. And sometimes that's administratively easy, but you're right, the voters still have a voice and they will leverage that power. And so we'll get into that when we go deep dive into each revenue tool about kind of the balance of where sometimes we see voters kind of come up when it's not something that's always necessarily on the ballot for them to review. The next question that I had is, can you just give a quick example of two different ballot titles and one that may or may not be more good for the public to hear?
You want to talk about open space? Might be helpful.
Sure. There's a couple of things. Don't bury your lead. Putting it on the ballot is, we would, and this isn't the actual language, I'm just giving an approximation. Didn't see this question coming, so I'm making it up a little as I go along. But, hi, I'm from the government, and I'd like to raise your taxes. I'd like to raise the taxes this much. Oh, and it's going to go for this stuff. No, you want to start with, here is a need, here's how we want to address it, and by the way, it's, here's the mechanism. I liken it to selling a car. When you walk into an auto dealer, they don't start you in the back room at the round table with the finance manager who's explaining to you why you should buy the undercoat. No, you walk in the door and there's this beautiful red car. Oh, I like that car. Oh, would you like to take a test drive? Do you know if you push this button, it warms the seats up, right? I mean, that's the process in any retail sale. And once again, this is what the this is what the model should be. They're customers. You are asking them to buy a product. So talk about the product, and then you can get to the details. So ballot language can, be very flexible in what you're doing first and what you're doing last. But the one that Christian is talking about is many years ago, Metro, the regional government in the Portland Tri-County area, put on a ballot measure for green space. It was a bond to purchase green spaces, and it failed about 60-40. And I was not involved in that campaign, but the jurisdiction came to a colleague of mine, Liz Kaufman, who maybe some of you have worked with in the past, and one or two other people, and said, that didn't go well. Do you have any thoughts? And so the first thing we thought of is, what's a green space? Does anyone know what a green space is? It turns out no. I mean, they know there's space and it's green. So it became the Open Spaces, Parks, and Streams measure. Ah, Well, that I know. I like those things. So just in the very framing of it, which appeared in the ballot language, that was very important. And, you know, not that it was the ballot language, but that's another one where we saw the work that needed to be done, the constituencies that needed to be brought together. So, for example, this is a lot of money, you know, a couple of $100 million, if I recall, that was going to go to Metro. But they were hearing, remember when I said talk to people who might be a little cranky? They heard from a lot of cities within the Metro boundaries who said, well, what's in it for me? That's actually an acronym that I use. It's WITHM. What's in it for me? And the Metro Council realized, you know, we ought to have some funding that is provided to cities to do the same kind of thing that the measure is being done in Metro. All of a sudden, people who were skeptical became allies. And that did sneak its way into the ballot language, that there would be funding for local cities. So that is, and by the way, the next iteration of this passed 60-40. So that is an example of how both ballot language and how you're constructing it can make a massive difference.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.